Madam Chairperson. Good morning, everyone. I'm privileged to stand before you this morning, privileged to have worked with the Alzheimer Society of Ireland for the past 7 years, and to be part of the Alzheimer movement. Many of you here today also share in this privilege, being part of the movement and supporting people with dementia to have their voice heard. However, I think this is where perhaps the privilege ends. The reality of living with dementia in the 21st century is far from being privileged. We all know that stigma and social exclusion associated with dementia impacts hugely on the lived experience for both the person and the carer. And it is these very themes that I explore in more detail with you here this morning. The title of my presentation is called Slaying the Dementia Dragon, Alzheimer Organisations Responding to Stigma and Social Exclusion. My contention is that stigma is the dementia dragon and that Alzheimer organisations have a pivotal role to play in addressing it. I am very aware that while many of you here today are involved in Alzheimer organisations, some of you are not. Well, don't you worry, because what I have to say to you this morning has universal application. In fact, I am pleased that there's a mixed audience here today, because addressing stigma and social exclusion is not something that we can tackle single-handedly. It's a multi-layered, complex issue needing systemic and societal solutions with all of the actors playing their part. It's a long road and undoubtedly a tough journey that we all must travel together. Before I proceed any further, I wish to acknowledge the dragon image you see on my slides has been taken from one of the cover of Terry Pratchett's books, world-renowned author who has Alzheimer's disease. And I have a confession to make. I have not sought his permission to use the dragon, but I have no doubt that he won't mind if I use it in this way. In order to understand the phenomenon of stigma in dementia and the social exclusion that it results in, I will briefly explore the issue itself, frame the challenge that it presents, and explore how we may find the solutions to the challenge. While stigma is a much talked about phenomenon in the world of dementia, perhaps it's now time to take stock of what is happening and really examine what has been said, who is saying it, and what has been done. Today I pose a lot of questions so that we may somehow together arrive at the answers that we need. Dementia is not a new phenomenon. It is actually centuries in the making. The word dementia, as many of you know, is taken from the Latin word demens, which means without a mind. Stigma is an entirely socially constructed phenomenon, one of our very own making. So our understanding of dementia is firmly rooted historically, socially, and culturally. So if, as we are, wanting to change the course of history, I'm certain you will agree with me that we are taking on a significant challenge. I know there's a deeply held appreciation among the people sitting in this room that the stigma associated with dementia is a result of how it has been constructed, how this construction is interpreted, and indeed how it's played out in everyday life. Dementia may well be viewed as the ultimate badge of shame. Research carried out by the Alzheimer Society of Ireland on perceptions of stigma and dementia describes dementia as a dark place still. It found that stigma was embedded in people's overall experience of living with the condition. Because of the stigma, people are either choosing to or been forced to live behind closed doors. So why do I refer to stigma as the dementia dragon? Unlike many other conditions and diseases, dementia carries with it some unique elements. There is no cure. Treatments at this point have minimal impact. The nature of the condition in and of itself, resulting in a decline in cognition and the ability to control your life, is massively fearful for us all. We know from research that when the diagnosis is made, very often the person sees it as their own fault, internalizes it, and begins to struggle with a sense of shame and inadequacy. Agnes Houston from the Scottish Dementia Working Group talks about the reactions she experienced when she told others about her diagnosis. Those reactions went from denial to rejection. To quote Agnes, "I started to be very careful about whom I told I had dementia. I started to say I had a cognitive impairment. It seemed more socially acceptable, with no stigma attached and no preconceived ideas." Agnes goes on to say, "By hiding our diagnosis, we help to create the stigma. We are ashamed of the condition." Yet the burning question still remains for me, why the shame, why the fear? I've come to the conclusion that it's a vicious cycle really. As a people, we have socially created particular meanings of dementia, which makes those with the condition ashamed of it, and this in turn becomes the lived experience. It starts again, and so it goes on and on and on. If we look at framing the challenge, we know that stigma impacts at many different levels and in many different ways. Upon diagnosis, the person with dementia is ascribed a new social group. This social grouping is characterized by exclusion, isolation, discrimination, and often mistreatment, resulting in a life lesser lived. In addition, family members and those of us who work in the dementia workforce experience stigma by proxy. An additional consequence of the stigma is delayed diagnosis and non-disclosure of diagnosis. Very often there's a dismissive response from the healthcare professional, limited access to specialist care, and relatively poorer quality of care. There is inadequate investment and lack of commitment of resources to service provision. Dementia is then marginalised within the healthcare system and not seen as a health priority. Finally, we witness lots of misconceptions and wholly negative attitudes in the public arena in relation to dementia. So you can see the vicious cycle that's emerging before your eyes. But we can break this cycle, and this is our challenge. And so this brings me nicely to framing the solution. In the centre, I have placed the Alzheimer organisation as the leader in taking action, as I believe we are the key to the solution. Central also to the solution are people with dementia and their carers. I will refer to these two key tools in more detail later on. If we are prepared and ready for action, then we will be able to tackle the broader issue of stigma among the dementia workforce and the healthcare professionals. In turn, we can begin to tackle the healthcare system and increase prioritisation of dementia within the system. We also have a role to play in changing the meaning of dementia in the broader public arena. Finally, this will lead to the active citizenship of the person with dementia, the antithesis of social isolation of stigma. We will have achieved our ultimate goal of breaking the cycle, having dementia as part of our everyday lives. Let me get back to the role of the Alzheimer organisation as I said I would. Whilst we may not be able to be everyone's knight in shining armour, we can be innovators and leaders. I would argue there's a moral imperative on the Alzheimer organisations to take action. Who else is going to do it? So let's take responsibility and ownership of the issue, and crucially, let's decide what we can and cannot do in order to assume a leadership and innovation role. Let's turn the key and open the door. As I say, Alzheimer organisations are imperative to the solution, but at this moment in our history, what are people with dementia saying about us? I quote them directly. "Why do I play this exhausting game of hide and seek? Is this my problem alone, or is it also yours? For better or for worse, the world depends on the people seated in this room to make it right for people living with dementia." We look for leadership from our leaders, from our Alzheimer's societies to do more than raise money for research. We look to you to provide more than information, group experiences, places to store us for the day. Why don't you do first things first? Directly support people with dementia in whose name you raise money. As both leader and innovator, the most crucial asset an Alzheimer organisation has is its people with dementia. They are the key to change. Therefore, there must be a clear sense of solidarity in the Alzheimer organisation, that we are walking the journey with our fellow travellers. We must engage with people with dementia in all aspects of the organisation. We must listen and learn. We must provide understanding and put in place what is needed to support people to have their voice heard. I would argue that there's an ethical obligation on the Alzheimer movement to become inclusive of people with dementia. Indeed, there's strong evidence to show that where there is direct contact with the person with dementia, the stigma is greatly reduced. We have amazing means of communication now, and we can reach out and link together new generations of people, including all of us fellow travellers. But before we can walk this journey together, we need to examine ourselves and see, is there a dragon inside us? Are we ourselves nervous and fearful of people with dementia? Are we embarrassed and somewhat ashamed of being a member of the dementia workforce and the Alzheimer movement? Is there a need to identify our own prejudice and face our own human fears? And at the very least, I'm suggesting that we must befriend the dragon first. This will enable us to internalize the beliefs and attitudes to ensure we value the person with dementia and their power as change agents. At this point, I think it would be interesting to revisit what people with dementia are saying about their worth and value in the Alzheimer movement. Again, I quote their voices directly. "We do not bite. We may sometimes need an explanation. We need to be told several times. We may get confused in ways you are not. But does that mean we should not be full partners with you in our crusade? Let us in. Affirm our worth by partnering with us." Only those living with dementia know what it's really like. Let us cease to be a sideshow, instead become full participants in the work. If we really believe in the value and the power of the person with dementia, I think there are a few questions that we need to ask ourselves. I think a checklist approach is good. Do staff, volunteers, people with dementia in our organisations feel stigmatised? Are we ourselves as organisations and healthcare professionals unwittingly serving to stigmatise and isolate people with dementia? Are we learning from what has been already done and auditing those experiences? Are people with dementia involved in our organisational structures? Are they represented on our board? Are they on our committees? Are they part of our volunteer corps? Change is from within. We need to change as people, change as organisations, and change as a society. We know there is a need for multi-level changes, which takes time. Don't let impatience hinder us. Leadership and innovation will show us the way. In the way that people with dementia need cues in their lives, we need cues to be different. We need to have messages and constant reminders of what we are trying to do. Let's stand out from the crowd and be different. Clearly, Alzheimer organisations cannot do this work alone. We need to work together to make it right. So where to from here? Earlier on, I talked about how we got to this point in our history. But what we need now is a clear vision for the future. Where do we want to go? We need a set of directions, and if we are wise, we'll construct a good roadmap. But what does this roadmap look like? A good place to start is to take stock of the current map and see how it's constructed. What are the current conversations and dialogue around stigma and dementia saying? Or in actual fact, is there a dialogue at all? If there is, are there new ideas emerging? Who is leading the dialogue? And who should be leading it? Should we demolish the existing meanings and understandings, reconstruct them, and ascribe a new set of meanings to what we know as dementia? Do we need rights-based principles to permeate the conversation? Do we need to create a discourse and dialogue about dementia as a socioeconomic and political issue and move it into other frames in addition to the medical one? We as Alzheimer organisations, people with dementia, carers, healthcare professionals and academics need to create a safe space for debate, discussion and reflection, and push out new meanings and conceptions of dementia. Together, we need to vision the future we want. In solidarity, we need to take ownership of the issue and assume responsibility as the role of agents of change. We can take a lot of encouragement from Agnes Houston's perspective on this issue. She says, "Whoever you are, but especially if you are a health professional working with people with dementia, you can be part of the battle to confront stigma. If you, like me, have dementia, do not be ashamed. Don't hide. Join with me to confront the stigma." I now ask your permission to spend a few minutes sharing with you some of the actions we've taken in Ireland to challenge the meanings of dementia and the ways in which we are attempting to reframe the messages. Standing outside the National Parliament building, this is a group of people with dementia and carers who participated in our first ever National Consumer Summit and who lobbied senior national politicians as part of the summit. We are aiming to place dementia at the heart of politics and the democratic process. This national summit led to the development of a Dementia Manifesto, a sustained 3-year national campaign to make dementia a national health priority. There is now a commitment from the Irish government to commence the development of a national strategy. We are key partners in this process. In the meantime, we continue to ensure that dementia is viewed as a political and economic issue that warrants significantly greater levels of attention. They say a picture tells 1,000 words. Isn't it so true? This is an award-winning photograph that appeared in the paper of note in Ireland. You're looking at Eileen O'Reilly, who was diagnosed with dementia at 54, with her daughter Ruth sharing a treasured moment. Isn't there so much beauty and love showing in this stolen moment? This is a well-known national politician, Michael Noonan, and former Minister for Health in the 1990s. While in office as minister, his wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. However, he told nobody until he went on national television recently, almost 2 decades later, to tell his story, in the hope that he would encourage other carers to come out, tell their story, and not to hide behind dementia. On the left of this photograph is Joe English, who's a 53-year-old man diagnosed with dementia, chatting to a national broadcaster who's supporting her work. Joe featured in a programme that was broadcast in May on national television, highlighting the issues that he and other people living with dementia face. His honesty and openness are immeasurable. We need more and more people like Joe to share their story. The broadcaster on the right, Pat Kenny, has used his position to create awareness and dispel some of the myths. So we are cultivating a community of willing dementia champions. I mentioned it already that we commissioned research in the Alzheimer Society of Ireland on the perceptions of stigma and dementia. This groundbreaking report in an Irish context provided us with the evidence and gave us a platform as an organisation to talk openly about stigma, to start new conversations and question the current status quo. We really believe that research is central to building our intellectual capital. To finish, I quote the very wise words of author Terry Pratchett, who says, "Talk openly about dementia, because if we are to kill the demon, then first we have to say its name." So let's once and for all slay this particular dragon. No swords or knights are needed. It can be done through talking, listening, learning, and engaging. Let's be dementia ready and lead the way together to create a future where people with dementia are active citizens and dementia is part of our everyday lives. Let's be the change we want in the world. Thank you for listening, and here's my contact details.